Disclaimer. To the Pharisees and Karens out there.
How dare you?
All guests on this show do not reflect the opinions of the host. The purpose of this show is to have interesting conversations, stretch our minds, and grow.
Not what we want.
If you are looking for an echo chamber, viewer and listener discretion
is advised.
You talk about extreme.
What is happening and what is up? Hold out your glass, because we're about to fill it up.
Torches high.
Look at it from a different perspective.
Hey guys, what is happening and what is up? Hold out your glass, because we are about to fill it up. Welcome to the Prometheus Lens Podcast, the place where the conversations are always enlightened. I'm your host, Doc Brown, and here we like to use the allegory of the Prometheus lens to take a second look at everything. Hey guys, if you're new to the channel, welcome to the hero's journey. Be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Down below we'll have our social medias at their various platforms. Be sure to check those out. That would be much, much appreciated. Hey guys, we'll start off by saying if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I know ads suck. But for $4 a month, you can get an ad-free listening experience and contribute to the show that you listen to and love every single week. But guys, I got another banger for you. This is a returning guest. I've developed a friendship with this guy over the past 3 or 4 years podcasting, and we've talked everything from Giants to Fallen Angel Tech. You've probably seen him on A View from the Bunker with Derek Gilbert and Judd Burton and Doug Van Dorn, some of our other favorites of this show. But I'd like to welcome back to the show Brian Godawa. Brian, thanks for coming along, man.
Well, I am a author of mostly biblical novels that deal with the supernatural, and they're basically retelling Bible stories, but adding or not adding, but sort of pulling back the veil on the supernatural world, and speculating somewhat on what might it look like during these. What might it look like in the spiritual realm during these historical events in the Bible and such. And of course, we already do know Bible's revealed some obvious spiritual warfare and stuff that's in the Bible. But the particular paradigm that I'm working from is what I call the Watcher paradigm. And that is in the Bible that, in its roughest form, it's the notion that, and you can see this in Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 through 10 in its basic form, that basically at the Tower of Babel, when man had worshiped himself and gods other than Yahweh, he built the tower and they try to deify themselves. And then God split the languages, right? And he spread the nations out onto the earth. And Genesis, 10 talks about like 70 nations basically. But there's something unique that Deuteronomy 32 talks about, that is, and it's in Psalm 82 and other places as well, that God places the Gentile nations that have, the Gentiles who do not worship God. He places them under the authority of these heavenly sons of God that could be called watchers, right? Meaning they watch over the nations. And the idea there is that there are spiritual principalities or powers that are over earthly principalities and powers. So if you have a city, a nation, or even a king, there is a spiritual being of some kind who's got authority over that creature and linked to that earthly power in some way, and such that if you have a war going on or a battle going on earth, there's a battle going on in heaven. Thus, we get some of these passages in the Bible that refer to that, but we don't get a lot of detail, right? Well, that idea is very fascinating, because then God says, but I will be the God over Jacob, and Israel will be my land. Canaan will be my territory, my nation, right? And so he's going into this world of all these Gentile nations who hate him, and he's going to have shine his light through his people, right? And so what does that mean? This notion of these spiritual beings, these divine beings that, in effect, the Bible calls gods by the Hebrew word Elohim, right? And what my Bible series, the several series are called. The first one's called Chronicles of the Nephilim, then Chronicles of the Watchers, and Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And I'm currently just released a new book in Chronicles of the Watchers, and all the series deal with this same concept that I just talked about. And Chronicles of the Watchers is sort of like filling in some of the holes, basically stopped talking to Israel through his prophets. No prophets from the end of Malachi around 400 BC all the way up until Jesus, the Messiah. And during that time period, well, what's that about, right? And, there's more factors that are a part of that. But the main idea there is that around 586 BC, when Jews went into exile into Babylon because of their idolatry against Yahweh, God destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem as punishment for Israel's continued idolatry, like an unfaithful wife committing adultery with other gods. So the idea there is that, he said 70 years, you'll be in exile. And they did come back after 70 years, and the temple was rebuilt. But the problem is Daniel then comes along as a prophet while they're in the exile. And he says, look, Israel is still not repenting, still worshiping idols. So I'm going to multiply that punishment 70 times 7. So 70 years times 7 is 490 years. And from this we get the Daniel's, chapter 9, the famous 70 weeks prophecy. But the idea there is that there's going to be, Israel will be under God's condemnation or judgment until Messiah comes. And then Daniel talks about these 4 kingdoms over, repetitiously over and over again. The Babylonians, the 4 kingdoms through history, who will be oppressing or ruling over Israel. Again, because of her unfaithfulness to Yahweh, they will be under the yoke of either slavery or oppression of these foreign nations. And Daniel lists them out as being first the Babylonian kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar, followed by the Medo-Persian kingdom under Cyrus and others, and then the Greek kingdom, which began with Alexander the Great, and that split up in 4 other kingdoms. And then ultimately the ancient Roman kingdom, under which then Messiah would come. And that's what Daniel's all about how Israel would be under that oppression until Messiah comes to free them. And I say all that because in the meantime, God stops talking around 400 BC. And Malachi says, now the next prophet will be Elijah, will be returning and to announce the coming of the Lord. And that, of course, was Jesus. And Jesus said John the Baptist was Elijah that was spoken of. So, but this is fascinating because what's going on in this time period? Well, Israel's still around and things are going on, but God is giving a description of the events that are going to occur, some of the events that will occur over these 400 years. And this is what Daniel talks about, and return it back to its holiness, right? Get rid of the abomination of desolation, etc. And that's where the story of Hanukkah comes from, because the rededication of the holiness of the temple is that festival, is what it's all about. And so that's the story. That's the first story in the Maccabees, and there were other wars that continued on after that. But that's the story I'm retelling in this new novel set called Judah Maccabee, parts 1 and 2. There's two novels actually. And so, so that's the sort of the big story. But the other component is that spiritual warfare element that's unique in all of my stories, that I bring in this notion of these spiritual powers over the nations, and, rooted in the biblical concept of these watchers who are allotted these Gentile nations, and they're not good guys. Their watchers are bad guys. And they're fallen angels, basically. So, but what happens is, remember how I said that whatever happens on earth happens in heaven. So all the historical events have corresponding spiritual warfare components going on. So, for example, when the king of Greece, now who are the gods of Greece? The one thing I didn't mention was, my premise here is that what if the gods of the ancient world, like Zeus in Greece and Ra and Horus in Egypt and Baal in Canaan, what if those gods were actually expressions of actual demonic beings who existed, and they were masquerading as these gods of the nations because they were these fallen watchers who were authorities over the nations. So there's that sign, maybe not a one-to-one correspondence, but certainly the idea of these gods that the nations are worshiping are actually these fallen angels. And that's the premise of my storyline. So when the Greek king who has Zeus and Hera and Apollo, when he goes and invades Egypt, you've got the king down in Egypt, and the gods down there are Horus, right? Isis, Sekhmet, all these, Set, all these gods. Well, there's also a confrontation between those gods because there's a confrontation in Earth. So I have storylines that are similar, but of course within them, I also make, have like it's sort of like imagine gangs.
Meta narrative.
Yeah, but imagine like mafia gangs at war with one another. Yeah, they're all against the cops. They're all against Yahweh, but they're also jockeying for power and fighting amongst themselves, trying to become the boss, right? Mm-hmm. And so when the Greek king overthrows Syria and sets up and overthrows Canaan, well, the gods of Canaan like Baal and Asherah, they have to now submit to those Greek gods because that nation is now over the other nations. So their authorities are over those authorities, if that makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes they may imprison them. Sometimes they may make them their slaves or whatever. But the idea there is that I'm building an interesting storyline. And at the same time, I'm sort of trying to incorporate a lot of the ancient mythology, the Greek mythology for the Greeks, the Egyptian mythology for the Egyptians, into the story of those gods and goddesses and basically the fallen angels.
Hey guys, it's no secret that every single day your dollar loses its value. If a man invested $1,000 in silver in the 60s, today that same $1,000 would have magically turned into almost $30,000. Silver and gold only continues to increase in value. If you have a 401k or money sitting in savings, that is just a number in a computer system that is one EMP or hack away from being deleted forever. I've recently teamed up with Cornerstone Assets and Metals and started investing in gold and silver myself. And I highly encourage the listeners, if you have money in savings just sitting there, invest it in hard, tangible assets. The same thing with your 401ks. Take a 20 to 30% cut of that 401k, that number in a computer system, and invest into hard, tangible assets that is proven to only increase in value. Be sure to check out the link in the description or the number on the screen, and be sure to tell them that Doc Brown from Prometheus Lens sent you. Torches high, guys. Are you a hunter, a hiker, or just an outdoor enthusiast? Well, if you are, you know that good quality gear is hard to come by. And finding all-American made is like finding Bigfoot in the woods. Hence the name of Squatch Survival Gear. Head on over to squatchsurvivalgear.com. Use the code PLP10 for 10% off store-wide.
In a way that will sort of educate people on their worldview of that day. It's not just a made-up story, but it's based on their ancient mythology. So that's how I work together all these things into this one, massive storyline that we call Judah Maccabee.
And if I'm not mistaken, too, like the earliest prints of the Bible, and even like the Catholic prints, had the first and second Maccabees, right?
Well, okay, so that's an interesting, in my research that I did, it was fascinating because I started to look into the Apocrypha. And there's a very interesting history, and it connects up to the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And nowadays, though, the Septuagint includes the New Testament as well, but I'll explain that in a second. But that was a really fascinating thing, and it's relevant to my storyline because, okay, so the Apocrypha is a series of books such as the first and second Maccabees and third and fourth Maccabees, Tobit, Judith. Some of you may have heard of these, second Baruch, Ecclesiasticus, Wisdom of Solomon. And there's varying of these books and some additional additions to Daniel. And they've been around for a long time, and they are included in the Greek, what we call the Greek Septuagint. And the Greek Septuagint is the Greek translations of the Old Testament. So they're included in that. And that's why many Christians do accept them as scripture. Roman Catholics do, or what they call deuterocanonical, which is sort of like secondary canon, not necessarily primary canon, but holy in some way. And Eastern Orthodox also accepts it, but Protestants don't. And that's okay. I'm a Protestant, so it's like, that's fine. But what's interesting is that what we think of as the Septuagint isn't what it originally was. What we know of as a Septuagint now is what we call codexes. And they have a few ancient codexes. There's three main ones of full codexes of the Septuagint, the Greek translation. And the Septuagint basically means 70. And it's a reference to the fact that the origin of the scriptures translated into Greek happened around 280 BC or so. And what it was the Greek king, Ptolemy Philadelphus, wanted, he's building this Alexandria library, which became the world-renowned library. And he wanted to get the scriptures in there as well, but in Greek, because everyone spoke Greek, right? Mm. And so he allegedly, called in 72 Jewish scholars, 12 from each tribe of Israel, right? Or was that 6 from, what would that be? Yeah, 6 from each tribe of Israel, something like that. And so they were to translate the scriptures for him. And there's some legends that are connected to that, but that's the basic storyline. And what's so fascinating about that is it was only the Torah at first. And then over the next 100 years, they would add the prophets and the writings who were the other parts of what they considered to be the scriptures in that day. But what's interesting about that is a fascinating providential thing, because imagine the Hebrews are the small little people whose language is obscure. Nobody knows Hebrew, right? And their scriptures are in Hebrew. How can the rest of the world know the truth of God, the word of God, because they don't speak the language? But by God's providence, he uses Alexander the Great conquers the kingdom, and God uses that evil for good by making everyone speak Greek. That allows the translation of the Old Testament scriptures into Greek that then make it available to the whole world, because now the whole world can read the Bible, right? And that is a fascinating, exciting, providential miracle, right? But this was done like 280 BC, right? So this is a long, long time ago. And what's interesting is the Apocrypha were not part of that. So at some point in the line, the Apocrypha were included by some people, but the Jews never included any of the Apocrypha in their canon lists. Even up to the point where even Josephus, who was a famous first century Jew scholar, he did not include them as well. They had the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and that did not include the Apocrypha. It was later when the Christians were gathering together. This, by the way, this is the other thing is, the Old Testament, remember, was in individual scrolls. Their books were individual scrolls. They weren't in books. It wasn't in one book, right? And so they had canon lists and references and scrolls that they would read, but it wasn't in a single book. And but when they first started putting first people that started really putting the scriptures into one book were the Christians, like in the first century and after. And they were the ones that started to include what they believed the Apocrypha was a part of that. I don't think it's scripture. And part of the reason is that, if you look at the apostles and Jesus in the New Testament, when they quote the Old Testament, almost 80% of the time they're quoting from the Greek Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament. And this is very interesting because it's not the Hebrew that they're quoting from. They're quoting from the Greek. But they never quote from the Apocrypha, and like I said, there was no single volume that included the Apocrypha anyway, right? And the Jews never included them in their canon lists. So it's not until later that the Christians start adding those, right? So that's kind of the fascinating history of the Greek scriptures, but it also gets into another interesting contrast with the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew translation, but that comes later than the Greek. And there's a whole issue there that, that takes me off topic. But nonetheless, my story takes place in that time period where, like 100 years later, after the Greek Septuagint was translated. So now we also probably have the rest of the Bible translated, and the Maccabees, that's their day and period. And it's the Maccabees that become a sort of a rallying call for Jews to stand up for themselves and such.
Yeah.
But also the martyrs of the Maccabees became an inspiration for the first century Christians when they were being martyred. They looked to the Maccabeans because the martyrs, at least, right? So that's an interesting, but yeah, it's a fascinating journey that I would recommend anyone look into, because it tells you a little bit about the Bible and the textual transmission of the Bible, things that Christians don't like to get into or get too deep in. Sometimes it's too academic for them, like the book of Esther, where see the name of God anywhere, and now Christians get it. Oh yeah, that's because part of the point is that even though it seems like God's not there, he is behind the scenes orchestrating everything. And that's what I think is going on as well in my Maccabees story, that God's relationally withdrawn, his spirit's not in the temple, and the high priesthood is under condemnation from God, because from this point on, the high priest is never anymore in the line of Zadok. And Zadok was an Aaronic priesthood that the high priest would come from. And Menelaus in this time period was not. And so he was an abomination to most Jews. But from that time on, there was never another Zadokite priest until Jesus arrives as Messiah, at least, right? And so that's another component where this, the whole world, the whole cosmos in a way of Judaism is completely messed up. But God is still at work behind the scenes, and he is orchestrating it all. The temple does get cleansed like Daniel prophesied, right? And then ultimately, Messiah would come and bring in that ultimate restoration that they were looking for. But that would even then be another 160 years from then. But that's sort of the journey that is included in my story. So I try to explain a lot of this stuff, but in an entertaining context. I don't want to get bored, and I don't want to be lecturing to people. My goal is to communicate biblical truth, but it's got to be in a very entertaining story. So my Judah Maccabee story is kind of like Braveheart. If you love Braveheart, it's got a very similar storyline. It just so happened that it was very similar in the original, in the actual historical events. No, I take about a year to write each of my books. But one of the things that I do is I actually write two books. I write the novel, and then I always try to include a book of the research, the historical and biblical research behind the novel for those Christians who want to learn that, because a lot of times they want to go, what's the real stuff and what's fiction, so I can, separate the two if I need to. And they're just curious. And I appreciate that. So I wrote a book called The Spiritual World of Ancient Israel and Greece. And, it's like 150 pages or something. And it basically describes a lot of that, because I found that a lot of Christians have really loved that. And I love providing the research, but it's in a separate book, so you don't have to get it. But one of the things I do is I do have an appendix in the second novel, because I mentioned this abomination of desolation. And I know that that's a big prophecy thing, right? And I know a lot of people have a lot of beliefs about prophecies like the abomination of desolation, and what does that mean? And didn't Jesus say there was one in his future? Yeah, he did. So, what I did was I added an appendix at the end of the second novel, where I just take 100 pages or so to explain what the abomination was in the Bible. And roughly, just so you can, your listeners can get a rough handle on this, there's different ways that people interpret it, but my argument is that there are two different abominations of desolation that are prophesied in Daniel. One of them occurs in Daniel 8 and 11, and the other one occurs in Daniel 9 and 12. And Daniel 8 and 11 is the one that talks about, and scholars have pretty much acknowledged this, that it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and his image that he set up of Zeus in the temple. That's the abomination of desolation that already happened in history. But then there's another one, and it's a different one. And that's the one Jesus is talking about, because that's the one that occurs in Daniel 9, where we read about, the one who brings abominations and desolation on Jerusalem. Well, not only does he pollute the temple, but he destroys it, the temple and the city. And that's something that Antiochus Epiphanes did not do. And so the first abomination of desolation only included desolation, not destruction. The second one, which is the one Jesus is talking about, brings about the destruction of the city and the temple. And that, of course, occurred in AD 70 that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. The temple will be destroyed and such. So there's I explain how that all works and how we are to understand that future tense and the past tense. And, it's always controversial. So I try to give as strong of a biblical argument as possible so people can be rooted in their understanding.
Yeah, eschatology, that is definitely a muddy water.
Yeah.
when some people get into. I love how Doug Van Dorn, I've heard him talk about it with I think he uses the word chiasm.
Yeah.
How everything just kind of rolls into each other like, gear wheels and cycles repeat and prophecy repeats. And it's a bunch of, as Mike used to always say, already, but not yet. Hey, what is happening, my Promethean Knights? Hope you enjoyed that highlight reel. And hey, if you did, hey man, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you want the full discussion, go down to the description, click the links for the Apple or Spotify, and get the full discussion. And hey, you're welcome.